name is Dylan Mullins. I am a creative experience public technology assistant with St. Louis Public Library, and I hope you're joining me today to learn about Blender, a fully customizable, free, and open source software used primarily for animation and 3D editing, but with a robust and far-ranging set of features useful in the whole production process. Blender was first produced in 1994 by Dutch animation studio Neo Geo and has seen extensive use across the media, gaming, and science industries, including pre-visualizations for the movies Spider-Man 2 and Captain America Winter Soldier, special effects for the Amazon television show The Man in the High Castle, and interactive models produced by NASA for many of their satellites and rovers, including models for the Mars rover Curiosity. Blender is packed with enough features to support the animation process from storyboarding to rendering, and many of those features can be grouped according to their uses, art and design, editing, simulation, and various other features across the industry. This includes modeling, painting and sculpting, video editing and compositing, cloth, fluid and smoke, and particle simulation, and 3D printing, 2D animation, and real-time rendering. This is in no way an exhaustive list of what Blender has to offer, but are among some of its core features and among some of the features that make it most sought after. Besides being a free software, Blender is also packed full of enough features that it can be considered an industry standard and is useful for everyone from your average consumer all the way up to the professional level. What we're going to talk about today, besides what Blender is a brief introduction of how to download the software if you're listening at home, although you can also come into Creative Experience in St. Louis Library, either at our central branch or at our bar location on Jefferson. We're also going to discuss what the interface and viewport are, what the differences between the two, including what objects you'll find in the viewport are, what the separate boxes in the interface are, and how to customize everything that you see. We'll also briefly discuss what workspaces are and what their related tools are and how that can be useful for you. Thank you for joining me today. Again, this is a program put on by St. Louis Public Library, and welcome. So first off, let's discuss how to download and install Blender on your home PC. As you might notice, I've already got Blender pulled up down here, so I won't go through the whole process of downloading the program for you to see. But if you were to go to blender.org on your whatever browser of your choice is, you'll immediately see this nice banner page and a bright blue button that says Download Blender. If you were to click that button, you could see it comes to another page with another nice big download button and the option to choose which OS system you plan to download it for. If you're on a Windows PC, you can just go ahead and hit download again. You'll see it pop up at the bottom of your browser or ask you to save the file depending on which browser you're on. It'll go through the download process, and when that's done, you would double click that file to start the installation process. You have likely installed a program on your computer before, but it is pretty straightforward. When you finish and click through, it'll take you through a short setup wizard. You can, generally speaking, just go ahead and accept whatever standard options come through that setup wizard, and then you will be good to go. Once you have the program downloaded, you can go ahead and open it on your computer. Generally speaking, when you first open Blender, this is the screen that you'll see. You'll notice that they have a few different file types depending on what kind of project you want to work on. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll just use a general file, but some other file types that they have for you standard are 2D animation, sculpting, video effects, or video editing. And then you'll also notice that they have some helpful links here on the side for getting started, including to their website, and a manual that you can go check out for reference, that is specific to your version of Blender. One really helpful thing about Blender, despite it being free, it is pretty regularly supported. Since I initially downloaded the program in June, it has already made its way to version 2.90. As you can see, I'm using version 2.83. There's likely no vast difference between my version and the version that you'll use. It's just general quality of life fixes that Blender regularly creates. Another thing that you might find incredibly helpful about Blender, and another reason I would recommend that you use it, despite being a free software, Blender also has an incredible international support community that regularly creates content for end users to learn and grow no matter what their craft is. If you've got a problem, you can likely find an answer within that support community. It's just back here on their website. If you were to go to their website and click support, it's got documentation, tutorials, community support, professional support, FAQs, just a whole range of things for any level of user to access. So yeah, we can go ahead and get started with Blender at that point. So now that we have Blender installed on our computer, we're ready to open up a new file and see what it has to offer. The first thing I'm sure you'll notice, now that we've got Blender open, it's a pretty incredibly dense program. There's a lot to see here, and that can be intimidating if you don't know exactly what you're looking at or what you're trying to get into. It was most certainly intimidating for me as somebody that doesn't have a graphic design background, so I can imagine it can be intimidating for the average user as well. So first off, just everything that you see, we're going to talk about navigating the viewport versus the interface. So what's the difference between those two? Well, easily enough, the interface is just everything that you see on my screen currently. This includes all the menu items at the top, all of your different information menus here on the right hand side, and everything else contained therein. And then the viewport is this kind of screen that you see contained in the middle of the interface. The viewport is it's the box that contains your 3D scene, or the collection of animations that you are currently working on. So luckily, there are a number of ways to kind of interface with this program, with the viewport specifically. There are a number of ways to navigate what you see on screen that can be kind of hard to figure out on your own, but we're going to go through them all. So just a very brief how to select things, right? So if I were to say I wanted to select this 3D cube in the middle of my screen, I could click it with my mouse. I could click away from it to deselect it, or I could click and drag my mouse if I wanted to select all of the items that we see on the screen. I could also hit the A key, or we could select using this scene collection over here. The nice thing about Blender is there are multiple paths to whatever you're trying to do. There are also an abundance of keyboard shortcuts to learn. You can find numerous lists of these shortcuts on Google via the support documentation that we talked about, and a number of places. And then you might be wondering, okay, I know how to select things, but how do I move what I see on the screen? Every time I move my mouse, it just brings up the select box, right? So we have a couple of options there as well. In the top right of the screen here, you'll see this kind of like axis with X, Y, and Z that correspond to the left and right and the up and down planes on your viewport. So if you were to drag the X, for example, you could move it around. If you could drag the Z, you could move it up and down and, around that axis. And you've got a whole 3D representation of what you see on screen. And then also, if you've got a pretty broad animation, you've got some other options as well. You can zoom in and out on the view by clicking and dragging that plus magnifying glass there. So say you wanted some incredibly detailed work on whatever object you're working with, or you really needed a broad view, you could drag it out. And then, if you had a really broad view with a number of objects, you could move the view as well. This includes, left, right, up, down, all around, but it changes what your orientation of the screen is. And then there's also this handy camera icon that will give you your camera view, which I guess is a nice segue into, well, what are these different items that we see on the screen, right? So if you want to see it from the camera, what is the camera? So the camera is this like weird little black pyramid item that you see here. It is what, if you were playing the animation, that is where your viewpoint would come from. So if I were to click this camera icon, you can see that I've got a nice view of the cube in the middle of my screen. If I click back out, I see my whole collection. And then you've also got your lamp object, which is what your light source in your animation is. And you have your collection of 3D objects, which, when you open up a general file, is always going to be this cube here in the center of the screen, or any mesh object that you create and add to your animation. So yeah. And then you've also got this handy grid icon here that changes the view of what you're looking at as well. If you switch it, it switches between perspective and orthographic projection. Perspective, of course, is your natural perspective. It's a state that objects appear further away, that are further away, they appear smaller, just like they would in the real world. So if you look at the screen, you can see that, the further away we get from the cube and the other items, the smaller they are, but the closer we get, the bigger they are. Whereas your orthographic projection, everything is the same size. It's like, so your orthographic projection is your 2D representation of your whole 3D scene. The orthographic's really good for proportions, whereas your perspective is, of course, good for viewing it in the perspective that we're going to see it in. And then we've got our interface, which is everything around the viewport. The really nice thing about the interface is that all of its sections are pretty customizable and scalable. You have a few ways that you can do that. You can click in between the borders here, and you can see this little double arrow icon pop up. And when you click and drag, you'll see that our information panels on the side get bigger and our viewport gets smaller. Or you could drag it the opposite way if you want a bigger viewport. You can also use this kind of plus looking icon to create a split view, and then you could have different modes in each of your views. You could change what kind of viewport you look at on each side, a number of items. And then you've also got, if you were to right click in your boundary here, if I can get it to pop up, you can also split it different ways and swap areas. So you could do a vertical split like we've got, you could do a horizontal split. So there's, one on each up and down, and so on and so forth. And then another really handy thing, other than being able to split and scale your areas, is your context specific info here at the bottom. You'll notice this kind of line of icons that look like a mouse. And if you see, as I move around and have different tools selected, or I'm in different work areas, those that information changes based on what we're trying to do and where we're at. You also have it changes based on your hotkey presses and just all kinds of things. And then you'll notice at the top of our viewport here, we'll go back to object mode and try to create a larger viewing area. You'll notice this menu here is all of your tools. Again, it changes based on which kind of mode and area and workspace that you're in. And to hide or show that, you can, of course, hover your mouse and drag and drop. Or you noticed there's this little arrow here. You can click that. Or if you wanted it bigger with more information, you could scale out and see that it gives you more information. And then also, the nice thing about the tools menu is that there are a number of tools kind of nested within several options. So you see that I'm on the annotate tool. If I click and hold that annotate, it gives me different options to annotate with based on what I need and what my uses are. And you'll notice that this little triangle icon in the corner is how you tell that there are different options nested within that specific tool. You have a couple other interface menus that you can use as you're working. At the bottom of your screen is your timeline, which is used for animation sequences, animation playback, and it exists under the viewport and controls that playback. So, if we had a series of animations here and I were to hit the play button, you can see that this timeline is moving forward. Of course, I only have a static cube, so it's not changing at all, but that's how you would view what you're working on. That timeline doesn't exist in all of our workspaces. You'll see in the modeling workspace, for example, here at the top, that timeline disappears. But if we were in the animation workspace, it comes back in a much more in-depth form. So a lot of what you can do in Blender is definitely context specific. And then we also have, so the items that we've got here at the top of our screen, or the right of our screen, are some more kinds of like interface menus that give us more information based on what we're trying to do. At the very top, we've got our collection of scenes. Scenes act as layers in Blender, kind of like the layers in Photoshop. And you can have as many scenes as you need or as you'd like based on what you're working on. And then under scenes, you also have these things called collections, which are kind of what they sound like. They're a collection of items that you have grouped within your scene. The really handy thing about collections is that you can nest items under collections and things like that. And then you can hide or show those collections either as a whole collection or as items out of the collection. So you see, I click this little eye icon next to collection and all of those items disappear. I click it again, they all reappear. If I didn't want the cube to show, for example, we could click that, or say I didn't want the camera view and the light source to show, we could click those out. It's really just based on what you need. You can like I said, you can have multiple scenes and multiple collections based on the scene that you're working in. It really just depends on what you need at the time and what you're trying to do. And then under the scene collections exists the properties panel. Um, the properties panel pretty much just displays every property you could possibly want about the scene that you're currently working in. And it's split up in a really handy way into different tabs. So the first tab here is always going to be your tools property. It's going to give you information about the tool that you're currently using and give you options specific to that tool. And then the next 3 or 4 tabs are scene properties, which are properties for your scene that you're working on, and it is your entire 3D scene. And then the icons 6 through 12 or so are properties for the active selected object that you're working with. So for example, if I were to select the cube, you can see it's active now. I would get information specific to that cube, especially within those tabs. And then finally, the last tab here is your texture properties. It displays information about the texture on the object that you're working with. I don't currently have a texture on there, so we don't see any information. A really handy thing about this menu is that if you hover over each tab, you can see that it gives you information about what you're trying to find. So you don't just have to go off of these arcane icons that they have. And that is everything that you're going to see within the interface and the viewport. Of course, it's, again, by no way exhaustive. This is an incredibly dense program, but it should give you enough of an understanding that you can start kind of working your way through and finding things that you want to work with and that work for your work style. All right, so the last kind of thing that we'll go over today for this tutorial is what the workspaces are. Workspaces are a really handy feature that Blender offers. They're essentially different tool sets that you can work in for the whole kind of production process that you're trying to go through. All of the workspaces are contained at the top of your interface here. And the really cool thing is that they're all customizable. They're groups of editors essentially designed for specific scenarios. Blender comes pre-installed with several predefined workspaces when you download and open it. But you can also modify which workspaces appear when you start Blender so it meets your needs. You can add and remove workspaces. You can edit the workspaces that already exist so that they kind of fit your needs a little better, or create entirely new workspaces as well. Blender comes installed with about 9 workspaces that it shows standard, and then your layout space as well. We'll run through those pretty briefly, and then I'll show you some of the other workspaces that they offer as well. So first up, you've got your modeling workspace. Your modeling workspace is just used to create and manipulate models or 3D objects. The really nice thing about this is that it makes specific vertices and edges and faces selectable in this workspace. It also removes the timeline, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And they're all the tools involved are used for manipulating 3D models, such as the extrude tool or the extrude region tool, which will extrude a piece of your model out. And then there's also the loop cut tool, which allows you to create a new collection of edges and vertices on the object that you're working with. And then we've also got the sculpting workplace up here at the top. the sculpting workplace is kind of related to the modeling workplace, but it is specifically used to sculpt on the models that you've created within a modeling workspace by manipulating the mesh layer. The mesh is a collection of vertices, edges, and faces that describe the shape of the object that you're working with. So it's the details of the object that you're working with. And you've got a whole bunch of different tool options. It's pretty robust. You've got tools for shaping your object like it's clay, for drawing. You can flatten, all kinds of different options there that you can use. And then we've got, so the next workspace is the UV editing workspace. The UV editing workspace is where you would come to add texture to an object. UV editing specifically, it is the act of using UV projection maps, which is the process of taking a 2D image and projecting it onto a 3D surface. So you'll notice this workspace is split into two windows. You've got your 2D surface that you would draw on the left, and then on the right, you've got your 3D object, which is where you would see your projection displayed. And then very similar to the 3D editing or the UV editing workspace, you've got texture paint, which is laid out in a similar manner, but instead of working on a 2D plane to display on your 3D object, you could just paint directly on your object here and see it turn into a UV projection over here. So it's kind of the opposite workflow that you would use for UV editing. And then you've also got a shading workspace, which is used to manipulate the materials of an object. You've got all these handy items down here that you can change the values of that will change the properties of the materials on your object. That's also how you would add different materials and things like that. And then you've got your animation workspace, which, as you can see, is kind of divided into three separate windows. You've got a much larger timeline here. It's a more prominent timeline used to more directly edit the animation that you're working with. You've got the similar object view that you have in your layout space that you can see your camera perspective, and then you've also got a rendering of the scene that you're working on. So this is what you would see. So we'll click that icon again. That rendering here is what you would see through your camera as kind of like a sort of final output of your file. And then related to the animation and the rest of it, of course, is your rendering workspace, which is how you test the final output of your file and see what it's going to look like before post-production. And then finally, you've got your compositing workspace, which is kind of a post-processing editor. Obviously, I don't have an animation for you to see any kind of post-processing work on, but if I did, this is where we'd be doing that work. And then finally, another really cool feature about Blender, you've got this scripting workspace up here. You can control just about every aspect of Blender using the Python programming language, and you would do that through that scripting workspace. And then, like I said, this is, again, I've said it multiple times, this is no way an exhaustive list of everything that Blender has to offer. If we were to click this plus button to add a new workspace, you can see there are several different kinds of styles of workspaces that you can add. And then within each of those, you can see if we were on the general, it has a number of options that we could select from there. If we were doing 2D animation, it's got a number of options there. sculpting, video effects. So if we wanted to do motion tracking, for example, we could add a motion tracking workspace, and then more video editing as well. There's an actual workspace used for video editing. So it's a really comprehensive software that you can use that does a little bit of everything. It might not do it the best, but it pretty much supports the whole production process in a way that isn't offered in any other software for free. So, all right. So that's been just about everything that I wanted to say and show you in this initial tutorial for Blender. First off, I'd like to thank you for joining me and for learning with us at St. Louis Public Library today. I'm going to take this time now to show you some sort of other resources that you can utilize on our website. So if we go back to our browser and we type in slpl.org, that's the St. Louis Public Library website. We've got, so within Creative Experience, if we were to scroll down to the bottom of slpl.org and go under Services and click Creative Experience, you can see what our department has to offer in the way of services for the community and other learning opportunities. Also take a quick look at our Your Library podcast, which is a podcast that our department produces that highlights things like library events and other things. And then also you can see that it's got our locations and hours here. Everything is generally available on a walk-in basis, but also we do book things ahead of time. You can call or you can stop by and just have your library card ready, and we'll get that going for you. We've got other kinds of events that you will find specific to Creative Experience on our page, or there's a broader events page for the whole library on the main page. And then finally, if you're interested in more digital learning opportunities, if you were to scroll back to the top of our website and click digital content, we've got this online learning tab here. We'll click that, and that'll give you access to all of the learning opportunities that we offer here at the library. The three specific ones that I'd like to highlight are Creative Bug, which are just a number of videos on the arts and crafts. You can do things like painting, knitting, crocheting, etc. We've also got Gale courses, which are just instructor-led online courses over a vast range of topics. And then also lynda.com, which is also LinkedIn Learning, which are thousands of courses taught by industry experts. You get access to all of these with just a library card, which is offered for free here at SLPL. And you can learn over a just astronomical range of topics. So I hope you come in and see us in person and check out what we have to offer, and come back and check out not only our Creative Experience events, but also the broader range of learning that we have available here at St. Louis Public Library. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you all enjoy.